He will speak tonight about what's sometimes called the revisionist Israeli history. So I will give him the floor for 40 minutes again, and then we will have a debate. Ilan, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. Good evening. It's a great pleasure to be here. Israeli archives, national archives, are modeled according to the British archives. A lot of the Israeli laws about many aspects of life are actually British laws and Ottoman laws. They inherited the legal systems that were there before. And one of the British laws is the laws of the secrecy of documents. In Britain, and as well in Israel, every 30 years, the government is obliged to open documents about the past. It is not obliged to open all the documents, and it can be very selective with what it opens, but it does allow you access to quite a considerable number of documents that were hidden from the public eye in the last 30 years before they were declassified, would be the American term for this. So in 1978, 1979, the Israeli National Archives opened the documents about 1940, according to that rule of 30 years. Quite a large group of professional historians in Israel were interested to see what these documents would reveal about the past. The vast majority of these historians said there was nothing new about these documents. Whatever we knew about 1948 was reaffirmed by these documents. What did they know about 1948? They knew that the United Nations has offered a very fair solution to the Palestine question in November 1947 to divide the country into two states. They knew, or they thought they knew, that the Jewish leadership accepted the deal. The Palestinians and the Arab world rejected the deal and decided to go to war against the new Jewish state. 6, 7 Arab armies gathered on the borders of the new state, tried to destroy it, but the state of Israel miraculously defeated these Arab armies. And during the war, and once the war started, for some not very clear reason, probably according to this historical version, because of a certain position of the Arab leaders in neighboring countries and of the Palestinian leadership itself, the vast majorities of the Palestinians decided to leave their homes and never come back. And that's why the 1948 war ended with two consequences: the creation of a Jewish state and the making of a humanitarian Palestinian refugee program. So the vast Israeli, the large number of professional Israeli historians who went to the Israeli archives, and I should say also the British archives were open in 1978, and some American archives and United Nations archives were open. So they said, yes, there's nothing in the archives that challenges the story the way I told it now, with all its elements. A very generous and fair United Nations peace proposal, an Arab and Palestinian rejection, and a Palestinian decision to leave the country, which saddened the Israelis, but what could they do? It is very surprising, and I can't explain to you why. We were 2 or 3 people who were professional historians who came with this story. We were brought up on this narrative We believe that as well. I mean, that's what I learned in school. This is what I heard from my professors in the university. And when the archives were open, I was just finishing my BA studies in the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and I was about to start a PhD in Oxford. So I decided to do a PhD on 1948, not because of any ideological ideas, but because I thought if you have new documents, it's a very good idea for a PhD student to have to base his historical work on documents that nobody else has seen. I was one of 3 or 4 people who said, wait a minute, the documents tell you a story which is very different from the story that we were brought upon. We found out, for instance, that the United Nations proposal was not a generous United Nations proposal. It was a plan that was negotiated between the United Nations and the Jewish Agency. The local people of Palestine were not consulted what kind of a solution they want. And they were 2/3 of the population, 66% of the population. So the only negotiations about the future of Palestine were between the Zionist movement and the United Nations. The Zionist movement said, we want a Jewish state over 80% of Palestine. The United Nations said, no, it's too much. You should have a Jewish state only over 56% of Palestine. And nobody said, what do the Palestinians say about it? I mean, after all, they are the native local population. They are 2/3 of the population. Wouldn't you like to know what they think about this idea? And both the United Nations and the Zionist movement said, no, we're not very interested in the Palestinian point of view. So it's not that surprising that the Palestinians did not accept an idea that was never negotiated with them. The second thing that we learned was that before the Arab world decided to go to war against the Jewish state, which is the date when the British Mandate came to an end, which is the 15th of May 1948. That long before the Jewish state was declared, and long before one Arab soldier entered Palestine, the Zionist leadership, both the military and the political leadership, decided that the new reality created in Palestine, the end of British rule, and the fact that there is a United Nations peace plan which the Arab world and the Palestinians reject, this historical opportunity allows the Zionist movement to ethnically cleanse Palestine. When I was sitting next to some Israeli historians, they started arguing with me. And they said, well, it's not surprising that we ethnically cleansed the Palestinians because they rejected the United Nations partition plan. And I said, does this sound to you a logic sentence? 2/3 of the population, the native population, does not like a peace plan that is offered by the settler movement of Zionism and the United Nations. We should teach them a lesson. Never say no to the United Nations and the settler movement. You said no, ethnic cleansing is the answer. And I understood, and you referred to this, that understanding what happened in history is not just about facts. It's about your moral values. If I don't share with the other historian the idea that even if it was wrong, and I don't think so, but that doesn't matter, but even if it were wrong of the Palestinians not to accept the United Nations Petition Resolution, and I stress for the second time, I don't think it was wrong to reject it, but let's say even some Palestinians think it was wrong, okay. The answer to this rejection is the ethnic cleansing of a state. That doesn't sound morally and ethically acceptable at any level. Now, of course, this was not a Zionist punishment for the Palestinians for rejecting the United Nations partition. The Zionist movement, and there's a very good book by a colleague of mine in London, Nur Masarha, and I suggest you read this book. It's called The Expulsion of the Palestinians. This book records very clearly how from the very beginning of the 20th century, the Zionist leadership believed that there is no hope for a Jewish state as long as there are Palestinians in Palestine. So the idea of ethnic cleansing the Palestinians from Palestine was not born as a result of the Palestinian rejection of the United Nations peace proposal. The Palestinian rejection of the United Nations peace proposal supplied the pretext for the Zionist movement to implement a plan they already had at the beginning of the 20th century. But the Zionist movement was very small at the beginning of the 20th century and did not have the means and the power to do this. So the second point we found out, those of us who were called to be historians, but I stress again, which was not found out by the majority of the Israeli historians who were looking at this, we suddenly realized that the connections that our historians were making were wrong. Because history is not just about facts, it is also how you connect facts. We did not deny the fact that the Palestinians rejected the partition resolution. That's a historical fact. You cannot rewrite history and say the Palestinians accepted it. We did not deny the fact that members of the Arab League, especially Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, and Egypt decided to use military force on the 15th of May to stop what was happening in Palestine. So it's not a question of saying there were new facts in the documents. There were new connections in the documents, which are very important. We were taught as Israelis that the Palestinians became refugees because the Arab armies invaded Palestine on the 15th of May 1948. In fact, I just looked before I came here in my youngest son textbook, just to be sure that they're still teaching it, because I wanted to be surprised. I said maybe I'll have a different kind of lecture in Prague. Maybe there's a new textbook in Israeli schools and I should change my whole lecture. So just to be on the safe side, I asked him to read to me aloud on the phone the section on this in the Israeli textbook that he is learning. So he repeated, and I calmed down. They still say that the Palestinians became refugees after the Arab armies entered Palestine on the 15th of May 1948, which is a lie. The Israeli textbook are lying. Now you're not Israeli, so for you it's not a big deal. But for an Israeli to find out that his teacher's textbook are full of lies is not an easy revelation. I was quite shocked when I was in the archives. It turns out that before the 15th of May 1948, before one Arab soldier entered Palestine, from the moment the United Nations made its decision in November 1947 to the 15th of May 1948, so you have about 7 months, most of the Palestinian cities were ethnically cleansed. By the time the first Egyptian or Iraqi or Syrian soldiers entered Palestine, there was no Haifa, there was no Jaffa, there was no Safad. The whole urban space of Palestine was gone within 7 months before even one Arab soldier entered Palestine. And when you realize that, in my own city, in Haifa, 75,000 people were kicked out in 2 days. And when you realize that this is what's happening, you suddenly see the Arab military initiative, which was not very impressive. The Arab regimes were very careful not to send the best soldiers. They were very careful. They had their own liberation struggle against British and French colonialism. And they sent a limited number of soldiers. The Egyptians, for instance, encouraged the volunteers of the Muslim Brotherhood to go to the war, hoping that it would be one-way ticket. That's why they wanted them to go to the war. And so it was not a brilliant military preparation. In fact, the Egyptian Senate decided to go to war 2 days before the 15th of May because the government of Nahas Pasha was, not Nahas, I forgot his name. Nukrash Pasha, thank you, was against it, but King Farouk was for it. And so they only decided about it 2 days before the 15th of May. So suddenly the Arab idea to send soldiers after 6, 7 cities in Palestine are being destroyed to the core does not look like such an aggressive act. It looks much more like a defensive act than an aggressive. Now, every city that was destroyed had a lot of villages around it. In the area of Jerusalem alone, in the month of April 1948, the Jewish troops destroyed 40 villages. In the area that is on the coast of Palestine, before the 15th of May, dozens and dozens of villages were destroyed. So if you were sitting in Amman, or you're sitting in Cairo, or you were sitting in Beirut, before the 15th of May 1948, and you were saying to yourself, there, according to the American newspaper, there's a peace in Palestine, so why are there 150,000 refugees in Jordan already in March 1948? So it's not a response to the Palestinian rejection of the United Nations peace proposal. It's a systematic ethnic cleansing of the indigenous native people of Palestine. This is what we found. And I come back to this idea of connections. We didn't find any new fact. When you live in Israel, you don't need a document to tell you that all the Arabs of Haifa are gone. You just have to be born in Haifa and you know that all the Arabs of Haifa are gone. You don't need to know that 530 villages were destroyed because you can see the remnants of these villages. It is the explanation in history why these villages are destroyed. And what is the meaning of this destruction of the cities and the villages? When 3 or 4 of us published for the first time our thesis that Israel decided to expel the Palestinians and used the Palestinian rejection of the United Nations partition plan to expel the Palestinians. And as a result of that, the Arab armies went into Palestine to try and stop it, also maybe because they had their own sinister motives as well. I don't want to idealize the regimes of the Arab world in 1948. They were not perfect politicians, as we know. But I think the public opinion in the Arab world knew what was going on in Palestine and wanted the government to act because of that. When we published that, it was very interesting. The first Israeli reaction was of the official historiography in the university, in the press. It's propaganda. It's a total lie. But quite a few Americans in Israel, as you know, anything has to do with America, I think also in Prague, unfortunately, anything to do with America immediately legitimizes something for some reason. Quite a nation of morons, but we all think that they are bright people for some reason. But that's another problem. Some American historians went to the American archives, to the British archives, to the Israeli archives, and said, wait a minute, they're right. Chronologically, these new historians in Israel are right. Half of the people who became refugees from Palestine became refugees before the 15th of May 1948. So the whole paradigm that Israel was selling, there was a war, and as a result of the war there are always refugees, what can you do, was not true. There were refugees, there was a war that completed the ethnic cleansing. Did not produce the ethnic cleansing, but completed the ethnic cleansing. So when American and British and French historians said, wait a minute, we think that this is a realistic description of the past, the Israeli official reaction changed a bit. They said, all right, you're right. Some were expelled, it's true, but the vast majority were still victims of their own leadership stupidity. And had they not rejected the United Nations petition plan, we would have left them where they were. At this point, we were 3 or 4 new historians. And unfortunately, my other colleagues said, all right, this is good enough. I mean, it's good enough that the Israelis admit that some of the Palestinians became refugees before they were expelled. And I must admit that from that moment onwards, I was totally alone. So in many ways, if you won't allow me out of this room after the lecture, there's no new history in Israel. I'm sorry to say. I'm sorry to say. It's amazing because quite a few of the Israeli new historians decided that if they reached a kind of consensus with the Israeli official historiography that says, yes, Israel kicked out some of the people, it's true, or massacred some of the Palestinians, but all in all it was a war and that's what's happening in the war, they said that's all right. I said no. And I wrote another book in 2006, but then I was totally alone, called The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, because I was not happy with my own version, which I wrote first in 1989, 1990, which fitted this model that, you know, it was bad enough for me to know that Jewish soldiers massacred Palestinians, expelled Palestinians, but it was very comfortable to say, okay, no, we were not perfect. We were not perfect. But still, basically, we didn't do something terribly wrong. I was lucky because there was another law that Israel obeys, and one should say to the credit of the State of Israel,